back. Thanks for joining me if you're new. This week I'm starting with my recently harvested castings. Now these castings are the ones from the Vermibag Mini, and they were very wet when I harvested them. So what I'm doing is just going through and kind of loosening the balls of casting that have formed in here. I'm not worried about hurting any worms because there really aren't any worms that are in these castings. That's one of the good things when I harvest from the Vermibag Mini, is that the worms tend to stay at the top if you do it right. So there wasn't any worms that were in here. It was mostly just decomposing food and dried cardboard. So I just put that right back into the top and continue to try to break down the clumps that had formed in here. Since I do need castings in the garden, I am going to be sifting these and using them immediately in the planting of my tomatoes and peppers. I have videos of my sifting process, and if you want to click on the link, you can watch how I go through and use a two-step sifting process. But otherwise, these castings are ready to go. So since I'm not going to sift them just yet, I'm going to cover them up and put them back underneath with the rest of the bins. Now for the castings from the Vermibag Tote, I know that there are a lot of worms in that. And when I lifted up the bait tray, it was pretty heavy from the worms that had gone into it. And I'm just checking through the cardboard level. And I'm just going to dump this right in to the Vermibag Tote that has now sat for a week. It doesn't have any food, it just had the fresh bedding into it. So I just dumped the worms right into it, food and all. I won't actually feed this Vermibag Tote this week because there's enough food from the bait tray and I don't like to add too much food. And once I get all the little worms that are hanging out, I just put the bait tray back in. The castings themselves were kept moist from the bubble wrap. And again, I'm just refilling it with foods that the worms typically do go for, which are the wetter foods and the sweeter foods, and just filling it back up and adding another level of cardboard to it that I will moisten afterwards. But usually it only takes me about 2 to 3 weeks to really get all the worms out of here because they tend to travel to where the food is pretty quickly. I'm wetting this down because I use dry cardboard this time, but usually I do pre-moisten the cardboard as well, and then just set this up for a few more days before I harvest again. And when you take a look inside the Vermibag Tote that I have, I'm just trying to spread the material out. And it was a bit dry this week since it wasn't a lot of material really inside of the bag. So again, moistening the material inside of the bag to make sure that it doesn't dry out as it's going through this baiting process. And that completes the update for the recently harvested bin. Now for my regular bins, they are kind of at a point where I feel like they're drying a little too much with the screen. We have gone through a couple of pretty cool days and it hasn't been as humid, and I'm thinking that might be the reason. But this side was drier than the side where I fed. But the worms are doing great moving back and forth through the castings. They're all throughout the area that I added the food into this week. There is a great number of worms on one side versus the other. And I still have to think, why is it that when I want to migrate my worms, they don't do this? So maybe I'll try an actual horizontal migration on these bins. I'm considering it since I'm not in any rush. But I'm going to still reduce the size feedings as I know I'm headed to harvest time with these castings, and just give them their grit and bubble wrap. And I'll think about the idea of trying an actual horizontal migration on these worms in the next upcoming weeks. The second bin as well looked just like its sister bin. There weren't a lot of worms on the side where there wasn't any food. and it was a bit dry as well. And then on the side where I did feed the worms, there were a larger number of worms, of course, on that side, and the castings were wetter on that side as well. So these two bins are definitely going to be harvested within, or not harvested, migrated for the harvest within the next week or so. I'm really happy with the consistency of them. Not so much with the bin itself. Again, these are not my favorite way to collect the castings, but they've gotten to a point now where I really do need to harvest both of these bins and add more material when I use these bins, because there's less and less in here, which makes sense because it's composting, but definitely not as much material as I would like. And these are now set up for the next week. And there's only one Vermibag tote update this week, as the other one was harvested. And this is the one that I had most recently added additional material to bring up the level. But all the worms are hanging out at the top still, not traveling around the edges, just hanging out towards the bubble wrap. But they are moving through the castings as the cardboard is breaking down. And I'm just going through this and giving it a good mix to make sure there aren't any clumps, no leftover food that's not being broken down, and just checking out to see the overall status of the worms. And they're looking good, even though there is a bunch at the top. There are some that are still hanging out towards the bottom. Since this one is not going to be harvested within the next few weeks, I am giving it a generous portion of food for the worms here, and then just covering it up. So that was just a really quick update on all of the other bins. Everything is looking great. I do hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for sticking to the end. Please like and subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.